Reverend Dr. Ross Lockhart is the Dean of St. Andrew's Hall at UBC. He's also the Professor of Mission Studies at Vancouver School of Theology, and he's really into missiology and practical theology. He really loves the local church, and that's the sense I get. And VCC, we've had the privilege of joining this PCC initiative called Evangelism Network. And so for the past year, Nuri and I, and then we looped in Andrew Young and Alice, have been meeting regularly with Ross. And he's been coaching us through our evangelism initiatives, which has mainly been alpha for us. And then when the lockdown happened, he just had really great insight and just helped us to ask and think about the right questions as we've been planning through this. And so this is kind of where we led to here. We're like, oh, we would love to engage our whole congregation, not just a small group of people who are interested in alpha, but invite a broader group. And so we've asked Ross to come join us. And one thing you might not know is that he is both an author and a collector of awesome bow ties. And so if you have any questions about either of those things, I'm sure he'd be very happy to share a little bit more about it. But Ross, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to hear what you have to share with us. And yeah, we're so glad you're joining us at 7:30 in the morning from Vancouver. Welcome.
Awesome. Thanks, Angie, so much. And good morning, everyone. And yeah, it is just a little past 7:30 here, but that's okay. It's my usual time into the office. And I love working with Vaughn's EM ministry. I think you have the two most awesome pastors, right? That Angie and Joe are like the most awesome pastor. Okay, we just got to get that out of the way first. Okay. And as Angie said, I am a missiologist, which at cocktail parties kind of ends the conversation. We were talking about awkward silence before. That was Micah's response when I heard his little voice, awkward silence. That was my favorite part of the morning so far. That's usually what happens after I preach, but that's a whole other story. And so a missiologist is simply a professor of mission. As an evangelical Presbyterian, I am fascinated by how the gospel is translated and communicated across cultures. And when I mean cultures, I don't mean necessarily ethnicities. That's part of it. But with two teenagers and an elementary school kid in my house, those are different cultures, right? Vancouverites, where we wear Lululemon and hug trees and eat granola all the time, is a very different culture than when I lived just off Yonge Street in Toronto, or when I pastored in Nova Scotia. Right? So there's the sense in which wherever God is deploying you, when you're not together as Vaughan Community Church's EM ministry, you're in different cultures. Like right now, if I had to guess, as a prairie guy growing up in Manitoba, I would guess Jason might likely be in a hockey arena with that kind of like cinder block, bad paint job behind. That's bringing back memories of playing hockey in small towns in Manitoba, right? So imagine wherever you're deployed in work, home, leisure, how do you communicate the gospel in a Canadian culture now? We're going to get into this in about 2 seconds. That is not always hostile towards the gospel, but often indifferent, or there's competing values. In many ways, we are seeing a cultural landscape more and more like that of the early apostles, where belief was contested. You don't have people believing the same things. And so the early apostles had to figure out, who am I speaking to? How do I communicate the gospel? That's why when you look at Paul in Ephesus, he is different in his communication than, say, Paul in Athens, right? He's trying to read the crowd. He'll throw some pop culture, some latest philosophy in for the Athenians that he probably wouldn't say to the Philippians, right? So you're trying to read the crowd where you are. So always happy to talk on evangelism. Angie's given me about 45 minutes, and then she's going to kick me out of the Zoom room. And so when Angie and I were talking about how would this be most helpful for an equipping day, I could do any number of like basic evangelism workshops, but I've worked up something new today, and I don't know if it's going to work, but it's specifically focused on COVID-19's impact on the church and thus on evangelism. So I'm going to be doing some stuff here, but really the hard work is what you're going to be doing. The heavy lifting is in your response. So please use the chat box as I'm presenting. If we have time, and I hope we do, we're going to go into some breakout rooms. But let me just fire up, let's go here. There we are. I'll share a screen, and hopefully you can all see that. And Cascadia is just the language that's used on the West Coast here. It's British Columbia, Washington State, and Oregon. There's a lot of work that's been done to say that the cultural norms are actually more in alignment north and south out here than east and west. In other words, Vancouverites have way more in common with people in Seattle and Portland than Calgary. Just saying. I love Calgary, love cowboy music, but gotcha. Okay. So you'll have to do some translation for the Ontario context, of which I'm super familiar. But this is where I'm located. These are the kind of glam shots that Vancouverites love to show, and everyone rolls their eyes. I know Toronto's beautiful too. This is where I'm speaking to you from, just to locate one of 3 Presbyterian colleges in the country, one at U of T, one at McGill, and one at UBC. So St. Andrew's Hall is the UBC one. So there's a couple of scholars from U of T that have done some recent work on changing patterns of religion in Canada. And Brian Clark and Stuart McDonald have written in terms of the 1960s as the tipping point. Now, it will be different depending on how we look at the PCC. And this is not just the PCC. This is Anglicans, Uniteds, Lutherans, to a certain degree, Baptists, and so forth, is that there was kind of a high watermark of church attendance and membership in the 60s that declined. In Korean Presbyterian churches, this would be different. But all that to say that the broader Canadian culture essentially stopped going to church in the 1960s, or they started stopping, if that makes sense. We use the language of Christendom, which means a privileged place for Christians in Canada. An example would be when I was at U of T doing my master's work, I was a research assistant for a church historian, and she had me in archives all the time. And I would be plucking out from the 40s and the 50s telegraphs from the Prime Minister's office to the moderator of the Presbyterian Church. And it would say things like, "Dear Sir," because it always was a sir back then. Going into cabinet today to make decisions on the following issues, I would appreciate your church's opinion as we make these decisions. 50s and 60s. How many of you think in 2020, the Prime Minister even cares what the Canadian Presbyterian Church has to say, right? That would be a difference, right? So access to power, a sense of being in the mainstream, was a mark of Christendom, which has simply declined, and in many cases here on the West Coast has disappeared. So the church has kind of been turned on its head in many ways. This is a famous statue here in Vancouver of the Upside Down Church. And it's led us in many ways, and COVID has only accelerated this, to ask the questions around what is the church. These are pictures depicted here of cave churches in a region, it's actually in the Bible. You'll read about Cappadocia. It's in eastern Turkey. It looks like the landscape of the moon. And during the early church, Christians lived in cave churches. And it's quite haunting today to go into officially an Islamic country. Some would argue it's secular. Yes, I get it. But under Erdogan, increasingly officially Islamic. And to visit these cave churches that are now museums, where once Christian communities thrived, where you see beautiful frescoes of, often half a face of Christ still blessing his church that's no longer there, right? And it reminded me, when I've been there a couple of times, of that church clearly can't be the building, right? So what is church? And figuring out what church is helps us in our evangelism. So we don't want to overplay. Some people have super rosy pictures of church. Now, I'm assuming most of you have been in church a long time. And so we don't have overly rosy opinions of church. We could ask Angie and Joe, for example, to share some of their worst church stories ever, but they won't because they're professionals. It's like when I meet people who don't go to church, or they stop going to church as a kid or something like that, and they'll say, "Oh, you're a pastor. Oh, I got problems with the church." And I feel like saying, "Yeah, get in line. I'm a pastor. I got problems with the church too. Like, I don't think your stories count as much as mine do." But I don't say that. I smile, and I'm pastoral and that kind of thing. This is my favorite story. Everyone loves to, when you talk about the church, people think, "Oh, Acts 2, we love Acts 2. You know, believers had everything in common." This is a dated reference. Little Micah wouldn't watch the show anymore, but my kids used to watch Teletubbies, which is just like, I used to feel like my mind melting when I'd watch that show, right? All these like little happy creatures all living together. That is not the early church, right? And evidence, 2 chapters later, one of my favorite stories that I rarely hear preachers preach on. So maybe Vaughn, you guys can preach on this. Ananias and Sapphira, which is an amazing story of a couple who wanted to make a big show of their donation to the church. I kind of picture them bringing in one of those big lottery checks and laying at the feet of the apostles. So session meeting, First Church Jerusalem, they bring in this check, but somehow Peter knows, the Holy Spirit has revealed, this isn't, they say, "Oh, we're giving you everything." And Peter's like, "No, you've held some back." And he calls them out one at a time, and they both fall dead at the session meeting. Someone calls for an adjournment. The board of managers carry the bodies out back, and they all go home. Worst session meeting ever. I love this story so much because it just grounds us. If you're ever feeling just like worn out, a little cynical with church, early church knew that reality as well. So when we're talking about church and evangelism today, we don't want to be like overly rosy. We want to look at things head on as they are. Someone who's helped me with that, of course, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer, a German martyr during the Second World War, who gave his life in the plot to blow up Hitler, he wrote this: "When it comes to church, the person who loves their dream of community, loves the dream of community, oh, the ideal church, more than the Christian community itself, becomes a destroyer of the latter, even though their personal intentions may be ever so honest, earnest, and sacrificial." So in other words, he's saying, like, let's not always have this ideal of the church. And this is probably going too far, and only the pastors will nod, but Calvin's doctrine of invisible, visible church has sometimes worked against us here and given us this idea, like there's this dream church, right? And trust me, having served multiple churches, there is no dream church. There are churches full of broken people who Jesus died to save, and a world full of those people as well, right? Okay, so I've been doing some writing, a little bit of publishing, a lot of reflecting and prayer on, like, what is God doing right now during COVID-19? What is God teaching us right now? And I want to run by just 5 observations and tie it to evangelism, and to get your input and feedback on this as well. So the first thing that I'm curious about is, I wonder if God is teaching us that we have put too much emphasis on Sunday mornings in the past. Now, Sunday morning is important. It's the day we worship Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's the day that we gather together. It was wonderful hearing, folks say, I think maybe it was one of you early on when I came on saying, "I just miss being together, seeing you." It's a wonderful thing. Sunday mornings are the highlight of my week. But often when it comes to making disciples, we've tried to cram a lot into, say, 90 minutes on a Sunday morning. And now that we can't gather in the same way, I'm finding, as I'm working with churches across the country, the ones that are kind of thriving during COVID are the churches that have been quite good at creating disciplines and practices of ministry for people outside of Sunday morning. Now, how does this tie into evangelism? Specifically, it's about understanding what we're doing when we're together. So when we're together, this model here comes from a missiologist, Canadian-born, lives in Chicago, named David Fitch. And he speaks in terms of attending to the presence of the risen Christ when we are together and when we're apart. So most people think, okay, I go to church, we sing, we pray, we hear outstanding sermons. Every now and then we have communion, we go home. And you know that you're supposed to like attend to God's presence when you're at church. And that's important because that's where Jesus is our host. And we join with fellow believers. Doesn't matter if there's 50 or 500, we're just together. And Jesus himself is feeding us. But we don't live at the church like all of the week. Even pastors don't live at the church all of the week. So why are we not attending to Christ's presence as much when we're scattered? And so he offers the challenge of two different places that God sends us every week. No matter what job you do, no matter where you live, you have to go home. All of us have some sort of home, right? A house, a condo, an apartment. In expensive Vancouver, it's like a basement suite. I had one student that actually rented a closet in a basement suite. He slept in a closet last year. That was a bad scene. We got him into St. Andrews Hall residence after that. And so wherever you are, then you are no longer the guest like you are when you come to church and Jesus is the host. Now you're the host, right? You get to decide who comes in for coffee, who you have over for a meal. In COVID times, maybe who you have in your backyard, socially distanced. But what the challenge is that as evangelists, we are paying attention as closely in those conversations to the presence of the risen Christ. And it takes training. It doesn't come naturally to us as sinful human creatures to be aware of God's presence. So we're listening to conversations. We're listening to stories of pain and brokenness that for those of us who maybe live in more affluent communities, I once pastored in West Vancouver, which has the wealthiest postal code in Canada. And what I found was people were as broken there as when I go to the downtown east side, the poorest postal code in Canada, to do mission work. The difference was affluence meant they could wallpaper over their brokenness. So as a pastor, it was actually harder for me in a rich community because I had to listen attentively to what people were actually saying. Everything's great, everything's fine, I'm going to Maui this weekend, but actually what's really going on behind their broken marriages, the fact that they're over leveraged, that their successful company's actually a sham and could fall apart at any time, et cetera, et cetera. So you're listening for people's stories, and then you're asking, where is the risen Christ at work? And you're finding moments to be able to engage in really important spiritual conversations. You're not sitting there thinking, I need to get this person to church on Sunday so my pastors can make them Christian. That's old school. That's Christendom thinking, that lay people's job was to haul someone to church so the pastor could make them Christian through preaching. No, you're attending to the relational networks God has set you in as a baptized Christian, and you're finding ways to voice the presence of Jesus. That's when you're at home. And then when you're out in the community, the third one there, the half circle, is the kind of place, the hockey arena that we see there and so forth. And there you go, not as host, you don't have power, you simply go open-handed as guest, and you are curious about what God is up to, but you're also attending to God's presence there. So David Fitch has two examples. He goes to the same place for breakfast every Friday morning in Chicago. He does a little sermon writing, but it's, a coffee shop place, and people come, and it's a neighborhood place. And over the years, people know he's the pastor in the local neighborhood, and they'll often sit down and they'll have a conversation with him. Or he goes with a couple of buddies from the church to a bar every Wednesday night. He writes in his stuff he only has one beer, I think, maybe. And so there he engages in conversations. And I don't know about you, but I've often found people are more real in their conversations outside of the church than inside the church. right? And the challenge is that if it's only up to the pastors to speak about Jesus, then that's a pretty limited number of people that the pastors can reach, as opposed to saying, as soon as one of your pastors offers blessing, benediction, see you next week, then we're deployed, we're out in the community, and we are missionaries who are sent attending to what God is doing. So you can see it's much more than Sunday morning. A second thing coming out of COVID that we've learned, I think, right across the board is that the church is not the building. Now, I don't know about you. I was raised in Sunday school, and we'd even have songs about how the church is not the building, the church is the people. Yeah, okay, whatever. Except often the default is the building, right? And that's part of the challenge. But what we've discovered over the last 8 months is that church is possible without a building. The word for church in the Greek New Testament is ecclesia. It's mentioned 114 times, and it never once means a building. It always literally translated means the assembly. God's called out or summoned people. It's about people, it's not about buildings. And yet often when we think about church, I'm going to church, right? There's the sense in which we talk about a building. Tim Sorens, who's part of the Parish Collective, kind of a hipster group of Christians in Seattle, was saying recently when I was chatting to him, it's in his latest book, that their little guy, I think he's 4 years old now, they've tried, they think they'll probably fail, but they've tried at least with their child to never use the phrase, we're going to church, or daddy's going to church, or whatever. They might say daddy's going to a church meeting, daddy's going to the church building, but they're trying to raise their child to know the church to be the people and not the building. So in a few minutes, when we do breakout rooms, think a little bit about what has God taught you about church when you're not together in your building. And I've preached in your building. It's one of the most beautiful buildings. Here on the West Coast, we have ugly church buildings. We have like bad 1950s buildings that look like hydro substation buildings. You have such a gorgeous building. So it's not like, oh, the buildings. No, they're important. They're places we assemble. But I've also been puzzled, and I don't know, Angie, am I allowed to be a little snarky? Maybe it'll just be a little snarky. I work with pastors all the time, resourcing, equipping, and so forth. And early on in the pandemic, I was surprised how many pastors insisted that their online worship service be recorded in the church building. Some had really good reasons why. All the instruments were there. The guitars were there, drums, the recording equipment was there. Yeah, that's all great. That makes perfect sense. But then for a lot of people who never once broadcast a service online and were fiddling like with the worst webcams of all time, they were adamant that they had to worship in the building. And when I'd say, well, why is that? Why can't you just record on Zoom from home or whatever? And they said, well, the building comforts the people. Now, I'm not sure if it comforted the people or it comforted the pastor, but I said actually I think I was just having a bad day, and it was a pastor I knew well and could handle it. And I said, isn't that like idolatry, biblically speaking? Like that people need the building to worship Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? So it's a moment of discovery, I think, for a lot of people to say, what is the use of our buildings in order to make disciples for the risen Christ? Okay, so that's the second point, is the buildings. These two are actual PCC buildings that I've preached in the last year. Bottom one's in Pictou, Nova Scotia. Top one is Central in Hamilton. We do have some beautiful old buildings. This one may be something you want to comment on in your breakout rooms. Home is where the heart of discipleship is. I have often been humbled and have changed my discipleship practices by my Korean Presbyterian students here at St. Andrew's Hall. For example, it was Korean Presbyterian students years ago who taught me the importance of home worship, something that as an Irish Canadian Presbyterian, I didn't even know existed. Daily devotions and so forth. But years ago, we started, in light of this, Saturday night, having some praise at home, having a reflection together, doing things that now my teenagers roll their eyes at, like word share prayer at the dinner table, all that kind of stuff. The little one still thinks it's great. And all that to say, if we can't meet in church buildings to worship God, then in some ways, biblically speaking and historically speaking, what COVID has meant for evangelism and for practice has been a little bit like 70 AD when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and people couldn't worship in the temple anymore. That was the focus of attention for worship of Yahweh. And instead, people had to worship in the synagogue network, had to have it much closer to home. And even to this day, if you have Jewish friends, you'll know that the home is the central place of worship, and that families worship. Yes, they go to synagogue, some of them, but that home worship is really important. So what kind of practices have you been engaging in for worship at home would be something to talk about. Now, this one's a bit cheeky. All I need is Jesus stroked out instead toilet paper. You may not recognize the lady on the left. She's a hero here in British Columbia. She's our provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry. And the other images here, of course, to the reference, what is up with toilet paper? Why I have read Book of Revelation. I have visited Megiddo in Israel about 8 times, Armageddon, Megiddo, and I never see any references to toilet paper. So why is it that the end of the world in March brought on a rush buy of toilet paper? That was odd. My mom in Manitoba just got locked down for another 3 weeks, and I called her and she said, yep, toilet paper's out again. I'm like, what is going on? What this fourth observation is really about is yes, as Presbyterians, we have this doctrine of total human depravity, which some people find depressing. I just find honest. And that is to say, be suspicious of people's motives, that we are at the core broken, sinful human beings in need of redemption. What does this have to do with toilet paper? All that to say, the way people have reacted, and this is more with an evangelism focus outward, has been interesting. For those who remember moments of crisis in the past, I can think of being a pastor in Nova Scotia during 9/11 and watching the churches fill with people. Some of you may be too young to remember that, but terrorist attacks New York, of course, as you know. I was reminded of this with my teenage daughter when September 11th was a notation in her history book. I thought, oh man, I'm old. But people flooded to church when there was a sense of crisis, even if they weren't churchgoers. But has that happened during COVID-19? Now, some will jump right away and say, hey, our worship attendance is up online. Awesome. Praise God. I would say go back and look at the stats. Are they sticking with you throughout the entire service? Are they just clicking on? Are we recycling saints? Are these people who are already Christian, right? Because my data, my research is showing, and even just some anecdotal, I live in a townhouse complex where everyone else is either angry atheist or affable agnostic, and we're known as the spiritual people. I have yet to see one person knock on my door saying, we're in a panic, pastor, the world is ending, help us. No. Where do people place their trust? In provincial health officers, in authority figures like that now, in provision for themselves and their family, panic buying and so forth. All that to say that the old school evangelism techniques used to assume that deep down people knew they needed Jesus. And so you just kind of needed to get there. I would say I think it's more nuanced than that now. I think we need to try and listen more carefully to the pain points in people's lives and to be present with them and to love them not as an object, but as a subject, right? Not as someone simply to lead towards conversion through the power of the Holy Spirit and then move on, but to really share life deeply with. Okay, you've almost made it. Fifth one, this is a gross one, apologize, speak moistly to me. If you just cringed, you're right to cringe. It's not my language, don't throw things at the screen. This is our prime minister, I'm not being political, it's our prime minister. You remember early on, it was natural, he said don't breathe on people, but the phrase he coined was don't speak moistly on people. And he actually recoiled at the press conference when he said it. I think he said, oh, gross, it is gross. But the idea here is that we are an incarnational people. Now, you may not be familiar with that language. I don't even know what the word translates for your main service into Korean. But I don't know if at Christmas in the EM ministry you use incarnational. We usually talk about incarnational being God in the flesh. And part of the challenge has been, as an incarnational faith, that God came to be with us in Jesus Christ, that Jesus, clearest revelation, God with skin on. We're used to being together in person. And now we're apart. Or are we? This is part of the challenge for COVID-19 and church and our witness, is now we gather, and in many ways we're learning how this is community. I have to say, I have been preaching a lot online during COVID and using breakout rooms for prayer. Our presbytery meetings have moved online. They're usually quite grim and just not the kind of place you want to go. It's presbytery meetings sometimes are where hope goes to die. And yet we've been using breakout rooms to pray with each other for a full half an hour. We never used to do that. Yeah, there was a perfunctory prayer at the beginning and you had to listen to some half-baked sermon. But now we're actually being honest about what we're struggling with. And we're literally praying for each other over the computer. And I don't want to lose that whenever we get back in person. But I don't know if people will be as vulnerable and as open when they're face to face. So this is a challenge that when we go into breakout rooms in a minute, I'd love for you to take a couple of minutes to discuss together. And we know that we long to be together. There's this great little section from 2 John. No one ever preaches from 2 John. It's like, oh my gosh, what an obscure book of the Bible. It's actually a lovely letter, 2 John. It's super short. And at the end, the author writes this: I have much to write to you, but I do not want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk with you face to face so that our joy may be complete. And I think there's something about that. We are an incarnational faith. I put a little picture of Toronto in for you. There you go. Eugene Peterson, who taught here at Regent on the UBC campus, one of the colleges I teach at, in his version, The Message, talks about the word becoming flesh and blood and moving into the neighborhood. So we know that God is active in our lives. God is here close to us. We know the pain of separation. You can see the Bible quote I read for you there. I mean, the healthcare facilities alone, it's just been heartbreaking. I found it heartbreaking to see loved ones separated from those, especially from seniors. But we're learning new ways to kind of fuse together these relational connections. So here's a few questions for you. Don't worry, you don't have to do them all. Maybe you just want to pick one. What has COVID-19 taught you about the nature and the necessity of church? If that's too flowery of language, just what do you learn about church through this time? What's important? What have you brought with you? What have you left behind? And eventually when you get back together, like if you're being honest, you say, I don't think we need blank, right? And then how might you equip the saints for ministry, Ephesians language? But this is the evangelism task here. How are we equipping people? If evangelism is a speech act, you actually have to say something. Witness is words and works, right? So you shovel your neighbor's driveway who can't get out. That's a beautiful witness, a kindness, an act of grace. But if you never actually tell them you're a Christian, and the reason you do kind things for them is because you belong to Jesus, that's a problem. So when we're equipping people, we're helping them. What one of my professors, Tom Long, once said, you're enrolling them in the language school of the church. You're helping them to learn how to speak faith. So how are we equipping people for ministry when we're no longer gathered together? And then to that toilet paper comment, what's the experience of COVID-19 taught you about human nature? And how might you respond effectively with an evangelistic witness? I would say I was shamed in the first couple of days after we were locked down here that my immune compromised, angry atheist neighbor who's going through cancer treatments has made very clear that she thinks Christianity is ridiculous. she came over and rang our doorbell, and she had baked us a banana bread loaf. And she said, "I hope the kids are doing okay. This is a hard time for you, and I was thinking of you." And I said, "Thank you so much, so kind." I closed the door and I said to my wife, "I am the worst pastor in the world. Here's the lady who is clear she doesn't love Jesus, and she is more kind and generous. What were we thinking?" Right? So it's not that always human nature, it's a bad thing. Sometimes it's a convicting thing, right? And then around incarnation, as we're talking, what has changed for you?